When people talk about the Canadian Armed Forces, they usually say one of two things. Either we're absolute savages when it comes to war, or that we're peacekeepers. But both can't be true, can they? What is the true Canadian military legacy? Now, you might have read myths online about how the behavior of Canadian soldiers in World War I was so appalling that it was part of the reason why they drafted the Geneva Convention. Or you might have read that Canadians march into combat keeping the peace, armed with nothing but a smile and politeness. Obviously, neither of these things are true. But how could a country like Canada have two so diametrically opposed reputations? Are Canadians peacekeepers or warriors? Despite jokes like, does Canada have a military? Canadians are actually quite proud of their military heritage, from punching way above their weight and winning major battles in World War I, II, Korea, and Afghanistan, all the way to peacekeeping in places like Cyprus, Rwanda, and Haiti. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, peacekeeping is the term usually applied to United Nations operations in countries affected by conflict. Peacekeepers work to maintain peace and security, protect human rights, and help restore the rule of law. Peacekeepers can be members of the armed forces, police officers, or civilian experts. It goes on to say, as a result of Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson's leadership in the 1956 Suez Crisis and Canada's role in the UN emergency force he helped create, many Canadians considered peacekeeping part of the country's identity. And from the United Nations peacekeeping is guided by three basic principles: consent of the parties, impartiality, non-use of force except in self-defense, and defense of the mandate. Peacekeeping has proven to be one of the most effective tools available to the UN to help host countries navigate the difficult path from conflict to peace. Peacekeeping has unique strengths, including legitimacy, burden sharing, and the ability to deploy and sustain troops and police from around the globe. The United Nations Charter was drafted at the end of the Second World War in 1945. United Nations peacekeepers provide security and the political and peace-building support to help countries make the difficult early transition from conflict to peace. UN peacekeeping, almost by definition, goes to the most physically and politically difficult environments. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the Canadian Encyclopedia page goes on to say, however, since the 1990s, Canada's reputation as a peacekeeping nation has been affected by scandal and the failure of some overseas missions. And we're definitely going to talk about that later. So peacekeeping seems to conform with the progressive and polite nature of Canadians, along with the need to differentiate themselves from Americans whenever possible. So if Americans see themselves as warriors or shock troops, then Canadians should see themselves as peacemakers or something like that. This is all part of a greater post-World War II tradition of Canadians desperately trying to distinguish themselves from the United States in any way possible, usually by wrapping itself up in pride for its universal health care or its egalitarian social programs, and of course, the United Nations and peacekeeping. I could make a whole video about that, but if you want to see a video about that right now, you can go check out JJ McCullough on YouTube and watch his video called Canada's Left-Wing Nationalism. It's a fantastic video. Now, someone who served 14 years in the Canadian Army as an infantryman in both full-time and part-time capacities with 3 domestic deployments and a bunch of multinational training exercises, I think I can offer a little bit of insight towards this topic. So one thing I'd like to clear up is that there is no peacekeeping platoons or companies or regiments. Every Canadian soldier is trained as a soldier first to close with and destroy the enemy. That is always the primary objective of any Canadian soldier. It always has been and always will be. You don't join the Canadian Forces as a peacekeeper. Peacekeeper training is mission specific. It would be something you do as part of a larger pre-deployment training package that would get you ready for a peacekeeping mission. So the only way you would receive peacekeeping training is if you're actually going on a peacekeeping mission. And we'll get into what that is in just a bit. Just to be clear, peacekeeping isn't some sort of mandatory training in the Canadian Army. That's just not a thing. Usually on these peacekeeping courses, you're offered language packages, cultural sensitivity training, local law and law enforcement familiarization, and the rules of engagement and that kind of stuff. So the way it works is, for example, when an armed security force is deployed in the name of the UN, this is called a Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which basically sets out the UN Security Council's powers to maintain peace, opposed to a Chapter 5, which would require the home state to settle their disputes by peaceful means under the eye of UN national observers. So no armed security force or anything like that. There would just be UN observers monitoring the situation with the expectation that the state takes care of it themselves. What essentially happens is a group of people reaches out to the United Nations Security Council for help and assistance or humanitarian aid. The United Nations Security Council reviews media reports, multinational observer reports, intelligence reports, and military reports on the ground. They make their decision whether or not a Chapter 5 or Chapter 7 mission is required. If it's a Chapter 7, then the United Nations puts out a request to nations in the Security Council, and whatever nation is most well equipped to deal with the task will probably be selected or asked by the UN to intervene. And for a long time, that was Canada. We were the go-to peacekeeping military for a long time, but that started to fall apart for a bunch of reasons, and we'll get into all that. So whenever you see that iconic white and blue paint scheme slapped on military vehicles that reads UN or white and black, that's usually symbolic of a Chapter 7 mission. So those vehicles belong to that nation. So for this example, Canada would bring its own combat vehicles and then paint those vehicles in United Nations colors and livery in order to make it known that they are adhering to United Nations rules of engagement. Although I've never seen the Americans paint any of their combat vehicles in the full iconic United Nations paint schemes. That's interesting. I'm going to look into that for you guys. So that's peacekeeping in a nutshell. So what's Canada's involvement in peacekeeping? What have we contributed to peacekeeping operations around the world? Why did we get stuck with being the go-to peacekeepers and not the Americans or anyone else? It's not like it's the only thing we've done historically as a military. We have major achievements where we punched way above our weight in conflicts like World War I, II, Korea, Afghanistan. While as previously mentioned, peacekeeping was popularized by Canadians during the Suez Crisis in 1956 under Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. But its roots actually go back a couple of years before that to the Korean War. So in the Korean War, Canada was part of a 16-nation joint operations combat force. And from 1950 to 53 in Korea, those were offensive combat operations. Now, all of this was under the United Nations. But after 1953, when the Koreans signed the armistice, Canada transitioned into its first peacekeeping role. So from 1953 to 1957, Canada entered into a peacekeeping phase in Korea. This coincided with the Suez Crisis. Almost 27,000 Canadians served in the Korean conflict, and about 7,000 of those were peacekeepers. So again, the majority were offensive combat troops. Yeah, it was convenient that the world thought it was a noble cause. It was kind of novel at the time, and it was congruent with the Canadian spirit. But I think what it really boiled down to was Canadians now had a new way to distinguish themselves from Americans. Whether or not that was to our own detriment, I truly believe that that's why Canadians held on to peacekeeping so much. Now, in a strange way, the peacekeeping versus warrior argument can be boiled down to the left-right cultural war. Whereas liberal Canadians might view peacekeeping as a morally superior approach to foreign policy and international conflict resolution, Canadian conservatives might take more pride in past military achievements in battles like Vimy Ridge in World War I, or D-Day in the liberation of Holland and Italy in World War II, or the battles of Panjwai in Afghanistan, opposed to obscure peacekeeping missions from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Conservatives see these battles as the achievements that gained us the respect as tough, reliable allies and warriors. I think these things might even be forgotten on Canadians, and peacekeeping is newer and fresher in the minds of Canadians. So since the 1950s, Canada has consistently participated in active UN missions ranging from simple multinational observer missions to comprehensive Chapter 7 Security Council operations. Now what I'm going to do here is go through some of the historical peacekeeping missions that the Canadian Forces has been on, and I think after I give you a little bit of a background of each operation, you're going to start to figure out why Canada no longer is involved in peacekeeping in the capacity that it once was.
Peacekeeping in Cyprus. The United Nations Force in Cyprus, UNFICYP, was established in 1964 to prevent intercommunal fighting between the Greek Cypriot majority and the Turkish Cypriot minority. Canadian peacekeepers were the first to arrive and remained in strength until 1993. Since then, Canada has provided one staff officer to UNFICYP headquarters on a yearly rotational basis. More than 33,000 Canadians served in Cyprus. 28 died there. Peacekeeping in Balkans from 1991 to the present. Members of the Canadian Armed Forces, SAF, and civilian police forces, including the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, have served in peace operations in the Balkans. Their mission was to provide security and stability following the breakup of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Nearly 40,000 Canadians have served in the Balkans, and 23 KF members died while deployed there. Peacekeeping in Somalia in 1992. 93, Canada contributed military forces to UNITAF, a United Nations-backed humanitarian mission in the African nation of Somalia. The mission was hampered by the fact that some of the warring factions in the Somalia conflict attacked the international forces that were trying to restore, order, and deliver food to a starving population. The Canadian effort was also clouded by the murder of a Somali teenager by Canadian troops. The crime, and alleged cover-up by defense officials in Ottawa, became one of the most infamous scandals in Canadian history. One Canadian soldier lost his life in this conflict.
This was a massive scandal for the Canadian Army. It resulted in the total disbandment of the entire Canadian Airborne Regiment, and the reputation of Canada, the good peacekeepers, being scarred forever.
Peacekeeping in Rwanda from 1993 to 1995, Canada was a leading contributor to a series of United Nations peacekeeping missions in the African nation of Rwanda. However, the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMAR, led by Canadian Major General Romeo Dallaire, was powerless to prevent the slaughter of 800,000 Rwandans in 1994. Following the genocide, a new contingent of Canadian troops returned to Rwanda as part of UNMAIR tasked with restoring order and bringing aid to the devastated population. Hundreds of Canadian soldiers, including Dallaire, returned from their service in Rwanda, deeply scarred by what they had witnessed. One Canadian soldier lost his life in this conflict.
As if the Somalia scandal wasn't enough, Rwanda was the cherry that broke the camel's back. General Romeo Dallaire even went on to write a book about this conflict called To Shake Hands with the Devil. It's a tough read, but a must read for a Canadian, especially if you're interested in this topic. This book totally exposed the flaws of peacekeeping and soured the taste of peacekeeping in the mouths of Canadians to this day. This marked the beginning of the end for Canada's high-tempo peacekeeping operations around the world. So as you can see, Canada's history of peacekeeping is pockmarked with scandal, underachievement, and what some claim to be a needless loss of life. The scandals don't stop with the Canadian forces when it comes to peacekeeping either. Other peacekeeping nations like Brazil, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, and China have been wrapped up in scandal too. Since Canada started peacekeeping operations, it's deployed about 130,000 peacekeepers worldwide, and it's lost about 130 men and women during active peacekeeping operations around the world. Now, although that's no small sacrifice, it's really nothing compared to how many combat soldiers and combat losses Canadian forces have lost during other conflicts like World War I, II, Korea, Afghanistan. It's not even comparable. Overall, Canada's involvement in UN peacekeeping missions has massively declined since the 1990s. In December of 1992, for example, Canada contributed about 4,000 personnel to active UN operations around the globe. And as of April 2024, according to UN reports, Canada has only deployed 40 personnel to active UN operations around the globe. It's practically non-existent in Canada anymore. Certainly not a priority to the Canadian forces anymore. Even Michael Ignatieff, a member of the Liberal Party of Canada, is on record saying, and I quote, "If you are a human rights defender and you want something done to stop a massacre, you have to go to the Pentagon because no one else is serious." End quote. And just a little fun fact for you guys. Who do you think the number one peacekeeping force around the globe is right now? Yep. It's China.
China is asshole!
China has the most blue helmet peacekeeping soldiers deployed around the globe than any other nation in the United Nations Security Council. So perhaps peacekeeping isn't all it's hyped up to be. At the end of the day, Canadian soldiers are trained to close with and destroy the enemy. First and first, mostly, that is their main objective and goal: to destroy the enemy and win the firefight. They are highly trained, versatile, and efficient killers comparable to any near-peer military. Peacekeeping is just another skill set that Canadian soldiers can fulfill and incorporate into their wheelhouse of operational know-how. So in conclusion, Canadian soldiers are absolutely warriors. Whoop! Northern Liberty out. Don't fucking tread on me.